Okay, welcome to all of you to our Zoom-only event, Can We Talk? Israel-Gaza on Campus. And I want to offer some opening thoughts about what we're trying to do here. Welcome, first of all, to a conversation that I hope will acknowledge the hurt and loss and anger that so many of us feel about the Israel-Gaza conflagration, and to a conversation that perhaps can chart a path towards mutual caring. A premise of this conversation is that mutual empathy for Palestinian and Jewish loss and sorrow is essential to ending the tragic cycle in Israel-Palestine, and a foundation stone for conversation that advances our understanding of this cycle here in America on and off campus. On American university campuses, I dare say, there's been little such conversation. There's instead been lots of heat and lots of gotcha politics. The Israel-Gaza conflagration has inflamed anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, sparked violent acts and threats, and led Palestinians and Jewish students to fear for their physical safety and professional futures. Some hold that such conversation is pointless. A prominent Palestinian scholar to whom I reached out in the course of preparing for this event told me this, quote, "I personally have no interest in helping to bridge a conversational chasm on campus. As far as I am concerned, there is really no conversation possible in these circumstances. Indeed, these conversations are primarily aimed at muting the moral outrage at these events. Some Jewish and Israeli commentators and observers, including people who are moderate to progressive on other public issues, have told me the same thing, or have said virtually the same thing in other venues. Had I not identified the earlier person as a prominent Palestinian scholar, you probably couldn't have identified which side of this conflict he was on. Including some of my colleagues at Georgetown, who have said exactly the same thing about the possibility or lack thereof of such a conversation. We're here to explore whether there might be a way forward for such a conversation, a way that's faithful to the shared morals of our many faiths, and a way that's also faithful to the reality that somehow we all have to get along. Our discussants are national leaders in their several realms. Each will offer a few minutes of opening remarks, and that'll be followed by maybe about 25 minutes of back and forth discussion, and then we'll take audience questions. Ellen Waldman, who's Vice President of Advocacy and Educational Outreach at the International Institute for Conflict Prevention and Resolution, will choose and pose the audience questions. Some were pre-submitted, and she's going to select others from those that you pose now via the chat function on Zoom. And we're inviting you, we're really encouraging you to offer your questions and thoughts via the chat function. And so that people who couldn't make this scheduled time can still have access to our discussion. This conversation will be recorded. And I'm going to introduce our discussants in the order in which they will speak. David Lebron was, for more than a decade, until 2022, the president of Rice University in Houston, Texas. Before that, he served as dean of the Columbia Law School. He's the former Beinecke Visiting Professor and Distinguished Leader in Residence at Columbia Law, and he's currently Clarence Carter Professor of Legal Studies at Rice. President Lebron has devoted much of his post-presidency time and effort to teaching and writing that aims to deepen our understanding of the place and limits of religion in our public life. Rabbi Sharon Brous is the founder and senior rabbi of the Icar congregation in Los Angeles and author of The Amen Effect, Ancient Wisdom to Heal Our Hearts and Mend Our Broken World, released just last week, and I dare pitch it to you as a wonderful book. She's presided at both the White House Passover Seder and the White House Hanukkah menorah lighting. Her thinking about the challenges posed by the Israel-Gaza conflict has been recently featured on National Public Radio, CNN, and the New York Times' Ezra Klein Show podcast. Newsweek and the Daily Beast have named Rabbi Brous the most influential rabbi in America. And Imam Yahya Hendi is the Muslim chaplain at both Georgetown University and the National Naval Medical Center. He's also the founder and president of Clergy Beyond Borders and Imams for Universe, Dignity, Human Rights, and Dialogue. And he's been a consistent advocate for interfaith understanding. Imam Hendi's writings have addressed topics ranging from women and gender relations in Islam to religion and Islam in the United States. Let's begin now with President Lebron.
Thank you so much, Greg. I'm going to try to be fairly brief, primarily because I'm followed by people with much more insight than I have. I was raised to think the best thing I could be was a doctor, and the second best thing I could be was a rabbi. And so I was a bit of a failure in my mother's eyes. And so I really want to defer to Imam Hendi and Rabbi Brous. I do think there's a sense of frustration in a way on our campuses because we think of ourselves as places to bring people together, to engage in dialogue. I've always thought that one of the most important aspects of education was to understand the perspective of others. And it's one of the reasons that it's so important that our institutions to be diverse in many different ways, that we can come together recognizing our differences and engage in dialogue and engage in also expressions of compassion. I think as Greg has captured it very well, this is a hard and difficult time for many people. Terrible senses of loss and injury, expressions of hatred in our society. And in some ways, universities are well suited to be kind of mediators in that conversation. Our students live together at Rice. Students are assigned more or less randomly. There are no sort of special residential arrangements. People form friendships across all kinds of unexpected barriers. Often the Rice student population is among the most diverse in the country, ranked number one many years in a row for interaction among students from diverse backgrounds. And yet my sense is, and I'm not at this point deeply engaged on the campus, that we're not able to use this opportunity the way we might want to bring people together, to use those personal relationships, which really are the foundation in some ways of the educational experience, to build on those personal connections, which are often very unexpected, best of friends across whatever barriers one might imagine. And that's part of the excitement, I think, of coming from backgrounds that often are a bit isolating into this kind of melting pot or mosaic, as it were. And so here we're engaged in this very difficult situation. And I think the question is, why aren't we sort of more successful? I wanted to make a brief reference to the sculpture behind me, which is a sculpture by Peter Heiser at Rice. It's only part of it. It's an enormous sculpture. One person once said, I doubt this is true, that these were the largest blocks of stone moved since the pyramids were built. I don't want to make that as an assertion. The sculpture is called 4590-180. It's in the engineering quad. Here you see the piece called 45 off to, I guess it's my left, and the piece called 180 sort of pointing above my head. I'm sorry, the piece called 90 is pointing above my head. And then there's a 180, which is parallel to the ground. The reason I mention them a little bit, the piece called 180 is this huge granite slab, about 6 feet or something off the ground. One of my favorite sights at Rice was seeing a class or group of people sitting on top of this giant pedestal of granite coming together for conversation. That's kind of what we want here. And instead, what we have is 90 instead of the 180. This sense of a giant slab dividing pieces of our campus, not engaged in serious conversation. And I think what we're seeing is a reflection and modeling of what we're seeing in our society. And like some of you, I probably spend a little too much time on X, formerly known as Twitter, and I'm always interested in that dialogue. And what we see is this anger and division, this deepening, this not reaching out, not trying to find common ground, not emphasizing the expressions of empathy, so to speak. And so I think we do have to ask that question of why isn't that happening? Why are universities reflecting what we see in our society, whether it's between Democrats and Republicans, as we're seeing now, even within, for those of you who've been following the politics in our country, again, it's labeling people, it's building antagonisms rather than bridges and connections. And I think, unfortunately, we are seeing that on our campus. And I think, just initially, maybe there are a couple of reasons for that. One is the common ground big enough in a way? And what are the limits of that common ground, right? And there are limits on it. We are institutions of free expression and free thought. But as we've seen recently, we think there should be limits in some ways, not necessarily in the point of controlling expression, but what we think ultimately, in some sense, is acceptable. And in this situation between Israel and Palestine and broadly across the Middle East, there are sort of, for each side, they're kind of what we might call no-go zones, right? That is, and I'm not an expert on the Middle East, but certainly for those who are supporters of Israel and dealing with the aftermath of the horrific Hamas attack, the denial of Israel's right to exist is kind of, if that's not part of the conversation that people are willing to have. And on the Palestinian side, and the terrible suffering that's occurring in Gaza, the denial of that suffering, and I think the denial ultimately of a Palestinian state in some form in the Middle East, if that's what's denied, I don't think there's going to be common ground. But people do have a lot of common ground, but I don't think it's being modeled for them. And one of the things I see is looking across our academic institutions, I don't see our faculty modeling this idea of dialogue, of let's get together and understand our differences, of let's get together and understand why our perspectives, let's get together and understand how complicated these histories are. And there aren't simple views one can take of these histories at the end of the day. Instead, the faculty seems to have joined that deep sense of division that we see in our society. And so the students are looking around and they're not seeing in many ways to say, well, we ought to be engaged in something different. So I get up every morning as an optimist, because otherwise it's just hard to get out of bed. And so I'm optimistic that there are pathways here that we can engage in conversation, emphasizing what we share, emphasizing our empathy for each other, recognizing that there are very different perspectives and history is very complicated and the present is very complicated, but we can engage in productive dialogue and not mirror what we're largely seeing in the society around us.
Thank you. Thanks very much, David. Thanks very much, President Lebron. Rabbi Brous.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Block and President Lebron and Imam Hendy and Ellen. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I said yes when you invited me because I believe we have to be in conversation with one another. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to do that here, and hope that it's always awkward to meet people for the first time over the screen. I wish we had been able to sit down for coffee first and really got to know each other. I want to start by just acknowledging the lived reality in Israel and Palestine right now. There is so much pain right now that human beings are experiencing, grief and trauma and fear. And we know that when people are experiencing grief and trauma and fear, the whole idea of connecting to one another, of kind of reaching out beyond the closest, most intimate, safest communities, circles around us is extremely difficult. And it's not just there, obviously. Imam Hendi, I understand that you have family that's there, and so do I. And so it's very personal for many of us, and I'm sure many who are here with us as participants today. And for many of the people who are on the college campuses, it's very personal too. And then there are concentric circles, and that grief and trauma and fear extends out even beyond people who have immediate family who are there and who are experiencing it. And so the campus and the street become this battleground in which we really don't have the tools to be able to find one another. And I'm deeply concerned about this, both as a parent of a student in college and who's in a really one of the epicenters of where this tension has risen up. And also just as a person and who's deeply concerned about our society and about the rifts that we're seeing and what they'll do to our democracy, frankly, if we take a bigger look at this picture. I also believe that every crisis and every point of tension is an opportunity. And Professor Block, you started by asking this question: might there be a way forward? My work as a rabbi is centered on the premise that we are living in a time of loneliness, social alienation, isolation, and ideological extremism and extreme division. And the only way that we can heal as individuals and as a collective, as a society, is if we're able to find our way to one another in celebration, in sorrow, and in solidarity. And so the question of our time, I think, is, can we see each other's sorrow? Can we see each other's broken hearts? And obviously, when we're in trauma, this becomes even much harder because our hearts are already broken ourselves. And so it's very hard to see someone else's broken heart when you yourself are broken. And yet it also positions us very well to meet one another in shared grief and in real compassion. And I feel that that really is the challenge of our time. When I see what's been erupting on the streets and in the campuses over the course of the last 3+ months, I think a lot about those courageous, influential Israeli and Palestinian leaders, even people who are kind of on the extremes, people who are not sellouts to their people, who know and understand that the only way forward is together, that together we can build a just reality for all of the people who live in that tiny sliver of land. These are people who are secular and who are religious, who are people who have often lost the most in this conflict, and who are really dedicated to bringing about a just political solution and a long-term solution. And in so doing, avoiding an all-out regional war, which will be an utter hellscape in which the amount of human suffering that we've seen so far will only be magnified and amplified beyond what we could even imagine in our worst nightmares. And in my moments of greatest despair, when I'm worried that we are just never going to find our way back, I continually look to these Israeli and Palestinian leaders who somehow are making their way through the muck and finding each other now. And I take great inspiration there. And so I am calling on anyone who will listen that if they can do that, we can do that work. And we can turn to one another in compassion and with curiosity from the midst of our own sorrow to find a shared language to express our desire for a just solution in which all people's greatest aspirations can ultimately be fulfilled. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Rabbi Braus. Imam Hendi.
Well, thank you all for this session. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Greg. for putting this together. In a way, I feel I want to cry. It has been painful for myself, for everyone on the screen, to watch the horrific scenes of people dying, women crying, and sometimes feel helpless. What can I do to make a difference? The topic is, can we talk? The question is, shouldn't we be talking? Is this really a question to ask? Is there any other choice? You know, the Arabic word for university is jamia, which really comes from the word jama'a, which means to collect, to bring together and assemble. That's what the word university in Arabic means, jamia. You bring people together, you bring minds together, you bring hearts together, and within that jamia, you bring diversity, you bring pluralism, you bring multiple ideas, multiple thoughts, multiple even contrary ideas. And within that jamia, you do dirasa, like the Hebrew word midrash, midrashim, a place where you study. And you do dirasa, you do the study by bringing ideas that might sound to be contrary to one another together. You come together to debate ideas, to argue for and against. Sometimes you hope that you yourself might change, might grow out or grow from something and become better by engaging someone else. When we look at the traditional, classical Islamic texts, we study that within that jamia, there has to be togetherness. In Hebrew, gam yachad. We need to work together. We together come to do that study, but to enforce the three values: politics of justice, economics of equity, and covenant of community. So within the university, we are supposed to come together, to study together, to engage one another intellectually, with information, with authenticity, with clarity, with integrity, but also the concept of hadara. We do that with civility. So how do we agree to disagree? How do we come to the table knowing that we might agree, we might not agree, but even when we disagree, we don't become enemies. At the table, when we engage ideas, we have to be ready to transform ourselves and convert out, not religious conversion, spiritual conversion, and even conversion of ideas and of stands. So for me, can we talk? We can talk. If there is a will, there is a way. Should we be talking? There's no other choice but to talk. Otherwise, we end up with the anti-Semitic and Islamophobic statements that are undermining the peacefulness of what a campus is supposed to be about. Unfortunately, the politicization of our campuses, the destructive mass media and how they cover the story does not allow us to do that with civility and with respect. As a Muslim, I am taught that whoever brings life to one soul, it will be as if he has brought life to all of humanity, he or she. But if you kill one, it will be as if you have killed all of humanity. In the process of learning, in the process of studying, in the process of talking to one another, we are ensuring that we're bringing life to people and we bring death to an end, so it does not happen anymore. That is what we are supposed to do. That's what we need to do, and we need to do it together. We share our campuses, and we cannot continue with this polarization that we see on campuses where the other perspective must not exist and shall not exist. I myself have seen so much of it. From the Muslim perspective, students who have their pictures on specific websites because they participated in the protests in support of Palestine or speaking against the genocide in Gaza. You know, at the end of the day, people might disagree with the terminology, but to go from the perspective of how you think politically to putting someone online to undermine their job or their access to jobs, that must not be happening on our campuses. We need to engage, as I said, with the clarity, with authenticity. We're not going to shy away. We're not going to sugarcoat things. We're not going to gloss over painful experiences and realities. And I agree with our professor, you know, that these are big issues and we cannot just gloss over them. We cannot sweep them under the rug. We need to study them. We need to have the right mechanism, the right skills, and the right tools to do that on our campuses without any attempt to push away that authenticity in any way, shape, and form. You know, in the Islamic tradition, we talk about the attributes of God, the attributes of the divine, that God is as-Sami', God listens, God is al-Basir, God sees things, and that God is al-Jabbar, God mends that which is broken. So in our ability to see the other side, in our ability to see their pain, in our ability to hear them and talk to them with the hope that God will be able to mend what is broken in that land that is meant to be holy. How do we come together to talk about how we can share that land? How can we come together to talk about how violence is not the means in any way, shape, and form? I'm going to stop here, but so this is how I would like to start this discussion, coming together, engaging one another spiritually and with authenticity, talking about the real big issues.
Thank you very much, Imam Hendy. And I'd like to start the discussion with this question. It's directed perhaps a little bit more to Imam Hendy and to Rabbi Brous, but really also to President Libran as a leader. When a time of when great trauma happens, and that trauma has been inflicted by another group of human beings, then leaders seems to me have the following dilemma. On the one hand, there's the powerful need to minister to, especially for faith leaders, to minister to their own people, their own flock, and to empathize with not just the pain of their flock, the sorrow of their flock, but the anger of their flock. And empathizing with anger inherently means a certain set of feelings towards the other, towards those who are seen as inflicting the anger. And yet the kind of conversation that we're talking about, and ultimately the kind of mutual empathy that we're talking about that could perhaps lead to an end of the cycle of tragedy, calls for exactly the opposite. It calls for empathy with the suffering of the other. And so that would seem to pose an acute dilemma that you all as faith leaders, and really any kind of leader, has to wrestle with. So I'd be interested in your thoughts, the thoughts of the three of you, with respect to how you as leaders moderate for yourselves and for the people whom you lead and counsel that dilemma. Your call is whoever has thoughts about this. Just jump in. No need to use the Zoom technology to.
I'm happy to say a word about that. First of all, I also want to cry, Imam Hendy, and thank you for your remarks. When you're speaking, even hearing just the similarities between Arabic and Hebrew terminology, I'm just reminded again and again of the closeness of these two peoples who've been set up by the world to be terrible enemies. I remember once we had a Palestinian and Israeli speaker, two speakers came to speak in our community one Shabbat morning about the work that they're doing together. And afterwards, they snuck out to have a cigarette out in front of the building. And each of them had the little entourage of Israelis and Palestinians. And I walked out by them and I was like, nobody could distinguish who's Palestinian and who's an Israeli Jew here. So it's, it's interesting the way that people become enemies to one another. This phrase that started in journalism, but became, kind of adopted by clergy as well, that our job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, is something that I think about with every single sermon. When my people are becoming too complacent and too comfortable, my job is to upset them and to push them and to challenge them to think more different, to think differently and to think more broadly. When my people are broken and in full sorrow, my job is to meet them in their suffering and to embrace them there. And I think that both of those pieces of the work are always at play, and there's never a moment in which we're called to be only pastor and not also prophet, or prophet and not pastor, meaning even from the depths of our sorrow after October 7th, even when we had people in our own community I had two board members who had immediate family that were abducted and were in Gaza. My job was also to remind people that we don't entrench in our narratives and close our hearts and dehumanize the Palestinian people living in Gaza. And I brought to my community that Shabbat a study that had been done by a Palestinian professor at Princeton, whom many of you know, I'm sure, who had done a study just 2 weeks before October 7th, where she found that some 75% of the people of Gaza did not support Hamas. And I did that knowing that it would be hard for my people to hear that, but also because these aerial bombardments were already starting, and we could not forget, even from the depths of our own sorrow, about the humanity of the people who were on the other side of this border. That's also our moral responsibility. And so I feel that we're always trying to engage in a way that's both meeting people in their grief where they are and holding one another in our sorrow, and also challenging each other in our community to stretch the boundaries of our circle of moral care and concern beyond where it might naturally go, especially when we're in trauma. And I will say here that I think a lot about the mourning rituals, Jewish mourning rituals, because I think there are a few things that Jews do really well, and one of them is the mourning rituals. And what we have, and other traditions have similar frameworks, is there's a very intense period after the burial called Shiva, which is 7 days of the most intense grieving. And during Shiva, we just stay home and we nurse our broken hearts, and people who love us come and take care of us. We are only surrounded by love. But you can't stay in Shiva forever. At some point, you have to get up, and the tradition has us actually take a walk around the block after those 7 days. And we lift our gaze and we see that there are other people who are also in deep sorrow, and also who are celebrating, and people who are just living in the mundane reality of the world. And so our scope of moral concern extends to them as well. You cannot do that when you're in deep, deep grief. But you can, once you start to move through the grief a little bit, find a way to embrace others in their sorrow as well. So I've been thinking about that a lot in the last 3 months, that it makes sense to me that when people are just hurting so much because of our own personal losses, that it's really hard to build bridges in that moment. But some of us have a little bit more bandwidth, a little bit more space, and we actually do have the ability. And if we can, we really must, because that's really our only way through this. And that what that does is it breaks the false binary of, are you tribal or are you universal? If you're if you're Palestinian, do you care about the Palestinians or do you care about the world? If you're a Jew, do you care about the Israelis and the Jews, or do you care about Palestinian suffering and global suffering too? We have to hold all of that. We have to care about all of that. And for me, the depth of my connection to my tribe is precisely what informs me in my yearning for other human beings to not suffer as well. And those things aren't contrary to one another. It might just be on a kind of a timeline where when I'm in the depth of crying with my tribe, it takes me a little bit of time to then lift my gaze and see the world of sorrow and a world of love that extends even beyond my own.
Thank you. Imam Hendi?
Thank you, Rabbi, and I really appreciate everything you said. This has been tough. You know, it is the people I minister to. I have a student who lost 67 of her family members in Gaza. So imagine a student like that walking into my office and broken and almost fainting on my sofa in my office. And what shall I tell her? What can I tell her in the moment when she is the only one who survived her family of aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters? It's not easy to talk to her about love. It's not easy to talk to her about inclusion. It's not easy to talk to her about let's reach out and listen. And another student, like an hour later, comes in, Imam Hindi, and broken again, and 26 of his family are gone. And the only one who survived is his mother, who happened to be visiting relatives in Kuwait. So now he and his mother are the only ones surviving. So it has been tough. It has been tough dealing with this. For me as a Palestinian, good number of my nephews have been arrested in the West Bank, away from Gaza, while playing games. You know, little kids between the age of 14 and 16 arrested for nothing other than getting arrested, or some people would call it kidnapped by settlers, and we don't know up to now where they are. So it has been, the reality is really too tough to deal with. But in a moment of ministering, I talk to people about the way we need to reach out to a God who is loving, who is embracing, who is Rahman and Rahim, who is merciful and compassionate, believing in tomorrow that is full of hope and has to have hope. But also it has been really wonderful hearing people that, like the rabbi, by the way, I read some of your writings on internet, that I took the link and sent it to some of my friends, because within my community, they think that the Jewish community does not speak for Palestinians. They don't hear that voice. And I think focusing on those voices, as you did, to bring that Palestinian voice to your community, I bring your voice to my community, that there are Jewish clergy, there are Jewish intellectuals, Jewish lawyers, Jewish activists who actually feel the pain of what is happening in Gaza, who are actually maybe on the ground, working in hospitals to help, to support, who traveled in from other places when they are able to go in. So that's how I have been able to minister to my community, showing them that there is hope, let's keep the faith, and show them that there are people who care about them. But it's not easy. It is not easy.
Thank you, Imam Hendi. President Lebron, any thoughts about this?
Well, the job of a university president is quite different than an imam or a rabbi. And I think it's become very controversial. A lot of different approaches to whether one should speak and what one should say. As I see it, there are kind of three different aspects of speaking. One, of course, that we've heard about is a sense of compassion and empathy. I think the test in many ways is always, what's the impact on our campus? And I think as our societies become more globalized, as our campuses are more diverse, as they're more international, as we have students from all over the world. I remember the attack on the mosques in, I think it was New Zealand. And, you know, that was a moment where I spoke out on the campus because it was about as far away as it could be. And yet it affected students on campus. And the same was whether it was an attack on synagogues in Pittsburgh or a church, I think it was in North or South Carolina, that we have to recognize the impacts that these events have on our students. And so one is this sense of, as a community, although not united by religion, very diverse, we want to express empathy and concern for the welfare of the people on our campus. And then I think a second element is judgments, and that becomes a little more controversial. But a lot of us felt the attack by Hamas in southern Israel was something that was truly horrific. One didn't need context to condemn that attack. And so some university presidents immediately tried a more balanced approach, but I think that's not necessarily what people were looking for. And then there's the more complicated set of issues around kind of just history and politics and how these things play out. And so going back to your question, Greg, about kind of what the right role of leadership is, and in my case, and again, I was no longer president when these events occurred, in this very complicated situation. And what we really had is we had events occurring and evolving over time, and then sort of being convoluted and sort of melded together. And yet, you know, the overarching concerns, I think, from where I sat were this empathy and outrage at the attack by Hamas, and then watching then later this immense suffering by innocent people, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and this expectation from our communities of the right kind of communication, in effect, that expressed empathy, that reflected our moral judgments, which were sometimes collective and sometimes not. And at the end of the day, one of the things we saw is it's a really hard job to be a university president. And part of what makes it very hard is that all these different kinds of expectations from leadership to speak out on events and come to these different kinds of conclusions. And that the result of that is that rather than bringing us together, which I think has been possible in other situations, here as the situation unfolded and the issues became different at each point in time, and the intensity of feelings were reflected, and that got kind of immersed with issues of free speech and other behaviors on campus. It became very difficult to find that common ground to bring people together. And people wanted to hear judgments about different things that were occurring. But I think what makes us a little bit similar, I'll just say a little bit, to the communities that the imam and the rabbi speak to, is we are a community. People want to be part of that community. And I think what we've seen on our campuses right now is those communities have become very, very deeply fractured. That sense of being unwelcome, that sense of being vilified is not what people have wanted and not what people have expected. And it's all of our responsibility to find ways to try to overcome that.
Thanks, President Lebron. A brief follow-up, and then I'm going to turn to Ellen Waldman with for the audience questions. And follow-up as to President Lebron. I could see, I mean, and you kind of began to lay out conflicting pressures or inclinations for a university leader. And there's plainly this role of facilitation of conversation amongst diverse perspective, both in the interest of enabling people who were wounded to be heard and in the interest of learning, going back to Imam Hendi's eloquent comments about the function of a university. There's also this idea of moral leadership, perhaps an older idea of what university presidents were expected to do, going back to the 19th century and before, going back to when universities were more closely allied to faith traditions. And there is, dare I say it, the impulse perhaps towards staying quiet and allowing controversies to dissipate based on the premise that the main job of a university president, whether or not people want to be open about it, is to raise money and to otherwise facilitate the rise of universities in the U.S. news rankings and getting the application numbers up relative to the admit numbers, and all those, more profane functions that in the real world, we all know that university leaders are judged by. And so I'd be interested in, President Leibon, in how you think about the tension amongst those several sets of objectives.
Yes, I'm not sure I want to, even by implication, accept your description of what it is a university president does and what's profane and what's not profane. It's all for the greater glory, as it were, and the discovery of knowledge. But, I think, Greg, as you know, there's a deep set of disagreements around this, right? We have some universities, Chicago among them, I think Vanderbilt, that really have said, unless it's something that directly affects and impacts our campus in that restraining sense, the leadership is not going to speak out. And, part of the problem is we do not only have the political, say, diversity within our campus, but an even broader political diversity among our alumni and other supporters, among the political figures with which we engage. And that has to be navigated. At the same time, in my view, we are institutions of values. And those values are very important. And so how we both reflect at some level those values and at the same time not impose our political judgments on others, I think is what's challenging. And I think what's, again, happened in part across our campuses is the modeling that our students see is to build these deep political divisions on our campus. And a lot of people from different perspectives, and you'll hear different claims, don't feel comfortable speaking out on our campuses. And so we're not the places of dialogue and listening that we need to be. These are very complicated histories. They are histories of deep disagreement. But a lot of the people involved on both sides have very firm conclusions about what is right and what is not right. And so we have to find ways to speak to that broad group and bring them together. So I don't think I've answered your question. I've just said it's a really hard job. And I think what's been missing is the very topic of this session, which is this obligation toward dialogue. And the primary function, I think, in our communication should be around, and this really goes back to what the Imam and the Rabbi have said, it's not religious counseling, but it is the sense of we understand the pain that people are feeling across our campuses, but to move from there, not so much directly to judgments about each other, but maybe about the need for dialogue. But again, that's not what the faculties are largely modeling. People put together sessions. They're largely sessions that reinforce particular points of view and not sessions that bring together people to exchange ideas and build an empathetic understanding across difference.
Thank you, President Leibon. I want to turn at this point to Ellen Waldman, who's Vice President at the International Institute for Conflict Prevention and Resolution. And Vice President Waldman is going to share with us a curated, see that's the contemporary hip word, curated, a curated list of questions that the audience has posed both in the period leading up to this event and during the course of the event itself. And we'll take such as those as we have time to do so. And since we got started a bit late, we will run till 4:20.
All right. Thank you, Greg. And thank you for inviting me to this very interesting session. I work for an organization that is committed to the proposition that we can talk, we have to talk, that conflict is manageable, it's and that it can sometimes be productive. And a word that I haven't heard yet is listening. We sort of believe in the proposition of radical listening, and that is a place where we can sort of hear each other's sorrow and hear each other's trauma and meet each other in that place. So let me turn to the questions because a number of interesting questions were posed in advance and throughout the discussion here. So I want to take two because they seem to be linked. The first one is we often hear discussions about the differences among us. Could the panelists speak about things that we have in common with each other? And then relatedly, an individual writes, a lot of the discourse surrounding this issue is making me feel less attached to the people on the other side of the issue. I know a lot of this is being juiced by social media. I've done my best to avoid it, but it's omnipresent. What can I do to inoculate myself against the rising feelings of animosity I find myself contemplating? So
Last one's a great question. Folks, thoughts about this? Whoever wants to go.
I want to maybe start by saying that, by the way, Ellen, I did speak about the concept of listening. I spoke about how God, one of God's qualities as Samir, that God listens. And if we are created in the image of God, then we are expected to master the art of listening. As God does it well, we need to do it well. And that listening requires that you bite your tongue and you glue your lips and listen to the other side telling you their story without being ready to respond or react or offend or defend, but rather just put yourself in the side of the other. Now, unfortunately, people talk about conflict in sensational media. It wants us to know that the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims hate each other. And I always talk about how historically Jews, Christians, and Muslims live together also beautifully in so many places. Look at Andalusia or Spain, when Jews, Christians, and Muslims co-inhabited that land beautifully, developed a civilization for hundreds of years together. Christians were proud of who they were, Jews were proud of who they were, and Muslims were proud of who they were. And they lived together. When the Inquisition happened in 1492, Muslims reached out to their Jewish neighbors, Jewish brothers and sisters, said, you are in. A few books were published in the last 20 years about how Muslims in Europe housed their Jewish neighbors when they were facing the Holocaust. My grandmother used to talk about, and I come from the city of Nablus, or Shechem in Hebrew, and my grandmother used to talk about her neighbor, her Jewish neighbor, who used to cook for their iftar in Ramadan. And they used to cook for their Jewish neighbor in their Jewish holidays. Again, this is how these people lived. Unfortunately, many people in the United States of America don't know that at one point we lived in that land and we shared that land together. Still, there are Jews in the Samaritan community in Nablus who see themselves as Arabs, who see themselves as Palestinians, as a part of the Palestinian culture. So I think we need to talk about that. We need to talk about how we share and have to share that land. Maybe this is where we can move forward. That I hope that no one thinks that by their existence, I have to be wiped out, or my existence has to wipe you out. The way to move forward for me, even politically, is to come to the realization that what makes that land sacred is its ability to accommodate each and every one of us, that no one is here to eliminate anyone else. Maybe that kind of theology, maybe that kind of ethics will allow us to take the right stance politically and socially now to say no to violence by any means.
Thank you, Iman Hindi. Rabbi Brous or President Lebron, any thoughts about this question?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts, and I hope I can address both of the questions. The first is that I would advise to the person who asked about social media to get off social media. I'm almost entirely off social media. I know it feels impossible. It's actually incredibly liberating. I only now read pieces that either come from friends or trusted friends who share their personal experiences, or from trusted news outlets. I just don't need to see every hateful thing that every troll on social media needs to post. I think it is a form of psychological warfare, what's happening right now, that is only dividing us. And there are people who are profiting off of that division, and I just don't want to be part of it. So as much as you're able to detach from that whole universe of toxic discourse, I really advise that. Put the phone away. It's a good spiritual practice anyway, but actually, in all of the time that you'll have once you put your phone away, what we need to do connects back to something that Imam Hamdi said earlier, which is we actually have to invest in building relationships and not retreating from one another. Imam, you spoke earlier about some of the students who've come into your office with just this incredible, unthinkable loss that they've experienced. And for me, I want to say that in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, I was just so devastated. I was in the deepest sorrow. And from the sorrow, I did reach out to a couple of my Palestinian friends a few days after October 7th. And I found that one of my dear friends here, who I've been in the work with for many years, has family in Gaza. And he had already lost 2 family members that day when I reached out to him. And all of a sudden, it shifted. I saw the death of every person across that border as the death of a loved one, of one of my loved ones. It just changes you to be in actual relationship. There's another leader, Palestinian leader in our multi-faith work here, who's has had a loss like the loss that you're describing. Just leagues and leagues of people gone. And it's absolutely horrific. I also know, because of my family that lives in Israel, I have family that was directly impacted by the car ramming attack that happened just 2 days ago in central Israel. My nephew stands at that bus stop with all of his friends, and they were all there that day. He was homesick. The more in proximity we are in, the more we feel the fragility and the tragedy of every single one of these losses. And so I really feel that those relationships are absolutely essential to the process of rehumanizing ourselves and rehumanizing each other. To the question of what do we have in common, we have so much in common. Aside from the linguistic commonalities that you've heard, aside from the familial commonalities, like the fact that we're cousins, aside from some of our core texts, which Imam Hendi quoted from the Quran earlier, that if you save one life, it's as if you saved an entire world. And that text also appears in the Talmud, and is really one of the core texts for me in understanding the infinite worth of every single human being created in God's own image. I think that there are other foundational commonalities between, in particular, Palestinians and Jews. And I just want to address this for a moment, knowing that doing so is going to make some of the people who are here listening uncomfortable. But I think it's just important to share this out loud. When I hear Palestinian friends talk about their sense that the world has abandoned them and does not care about the fate of the Palestinian people, when I hear Palestinians talk about their yearning for home and about their need for self-determination, I always have this feeling in my gut that there is a people in the world that are particularly well suited to empathize with those feelings, because from our own history, From our own experience in the world, we have felt exactly the same way, a sense that nobody in the world gives a damn if we live or die, that we desperately need a home where we can live in dignity, where our culture and our values and our language can flourish in the public space, and where we can protect and defend ourselves, and the need for self-determination. And so I actually believe that as much as we are set up by the world to be eternal enemies, that we are very well suited to understand one another, to see one another, and to empathize with one another. And that's why that vision, Imam, that you've just shared, and this language of shared destiny and shared future is such a resonant language for me, because I really believe that we have got to figure out how to live together in that place. And it's not helpful here in the United States to engage in such binary thinking that would preclude such an eventuality, when we all know that ultimately there are millions of people in that place and nobody's leaving. So I believe that part of our responsibility here is to build a discourse that's much more expansive, that's rooted in empathy, that is rooted in compassion, and that ultimately creates the space for the support and amplification of precisely those voices that are doing the work in order to realize that reality overseas.
Thank you, Rabbi Brous. President Lebron, any thoughts about this?
No, maybe I'll just say very briefly that, I think it's reflected in your question and some of the great comments of Imam Hindi and Rabbi Bruce, that we now have processes and behaviors that deepen divisions. And one of these is what I call labeling. We use brief descriptions of things that are very arguable in a way, in order to really vilify other people and label them in certain ways. And that really makes it harder to overcome those divisions. These are very complex, and whether they're judgments about Israeli behaviors or judgments about Palestinian behaviors, that those build divisions. And I don't disagree with Rabbi Bruce about social media, although I don't follow her advice particularly, in part because it's a window on the world, and particularly it's a window to how our students get a lot of their information, actually. And so recognizing that information that they're getting is deepening this sort of wall, when I use that metaphor of that 180-degree granite slab dividing people. The way we use language to describe the other is the beginning of that. And this sort of brevity on social media and this hostility, and that's a lot of what we see. People respond with that hostility. And I don't necessarily mean respond to hostility to a terrible thing that's happened, but respond to hostility to each other and to people trying to find their way in this morass of information. And so we have to find ways to diminish that sense of hostility to others on our campuses, to people of goodwill who have different points of view, and to engage them and find the common ground, which is realizing ultimately, I think, as you've heard today, that we have peoples who have aspirations for their people. And we have to figure out what we can do to bring people together to realize both those aspirations.
Thank you. Another audience question.
Let me also link two questions that seem related. One question is where to go for reliable resources. And the questioner says, I'm not saying completely unbiased resources, but things that are factual, that try and address multiple perspectives and that are thoughtful. There's also a question, do you, the panel, have any recommendations for resources, books, literature from left-leaning Israelis? So there's a desire for information, not from social media.
I want to intervene just briefly. A shortcoming of our panel, I think, I could be fairly criticized for this, is that we're not long on substantive expertise. Well, perhaps Rabbi Brous and Imam Hendi are, about the Israel-Palestine conflict and the history of the Arab-Israel conflict more generally. But there are lots and lots of resources, and maybe we could at least throw kind of a few bounce passes to sources that are reservoirs for exactly the kind of information that the questioner is asking about.
Right.
I'll tell you a couple of resources that I would recommend turning to. One is a book by Daniel Sokach called Can We Talk About Israel? Which is a very even-handed, fair, and accessible book that talks about the history and actually addresses a lot of the hard questions that people have about Israel-Palestine. And he is the head of the New Israel Fund, which is essentially working with Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel to strengthen civil society there and actually work toward the just future that we've been talking about. I highly recommend that book. I read Haaretz. I read 972. These are newspaper and journal that really try to bring in Israeli and Palestinian voices. And, I read the New York Times and the Washington Post and like verified news outlets. I don't always agree with everything I read in any of those places, but that's not the point. And I turn to I want to lift up the names of a couple of organizations on the ground that are shared, really just future organizations. Standing Together is one of them. Some of you may have heard from these folks because they just did an East Coast tour a month or two ago. They're doing extraordinary work together, Israeli Jews and Palestinians. The Bereaved Families Forum, which is, I think, gives me incredible hope. And also Combatants for Peace. And there are others, Mosaica, who are working with religious peacemakers. These are some of the voices that I think we should be attuned to. And it's important to hear them because we hear very naturally what rises to the top are usually the greatest vitriol and the most violent and the most extreme voices. But there are people on the ground doing really good work. And I think we have to attune ourselves to those voices and then do what we can to amplify them.
I may add 3 other sources: Rabbis for Human Rights, with the good work they do. They usually, every year, they plant olive trees that are destroyed by settlers or the military, and the way they do it with grace and love is a great story. Parent Circle, it's a group made of Palestinian parents and Israeli parents who have lost children or loved ones to the conflict. They do come together to engage with one another on the way moving forward and break the silence. Former Israeli soldiers who no longer serve because of what they have seen and what they have experienced. Just hearing their story, actually, it was my experience with one of those representatives of breaking the silence who taught me about the displacement of Palestinians, the discrimination of Palestinians, how the military carries out its own operations in the West Bank and in Gaza. Through him, I learned a lot.
David, do you have any thoughts about this? I know this is not your realm.
No, I just think one needs to read broadly across the spectrum. And that's a spectrum of what are the particular experiences and backgrounds. It's a political spectrum, and really understand that there are very different, passionately held views. There are different views about the past, and some of those views we see people putting forward about the past don't take into account the realities of the present. And I think that's a lot of what the task is, to somehow meld our thinking about the past with the realities of the present in order to construct a better future. And so I think what's important is, to read people with whom you just deeply disagree, but have a reasoned perspective on the issues at hand.
Well, thank you. Thanks to all of you, and thanks very much to our audience as well. We'll stop now, and I very much hope, I dare say on behalf of all our panelists, that this conversation can perhaps jumpstart some other conversations, some perhaps more private conversations that are conversations between people who do have very different perspectives. We wish you all the best in having those conversations and in the rest of life. Thank you very much, and we'll conclude now. And I suppose applause for the panelists is kind of hard to. Zoom has its limits, but I do thank you. I thank all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.